This is the video lecture for Lesson 12 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. In this lesson, we will discuss principal parts, the future active and middle indicative, and the future of Ami. So to begin with, what are principal parts? Well, the basic definition is that they are the basic forms of a verb from which all other forms can be made. In Greek, there are 6 principal parts. The present active indicative, which is the dictionary form and the one that we've already learned for most of the verbs up to this point. The future active indicative, which is what we will learn about in this lesson. The aorist active indicative, which we will learn about in Lesson 13. The perfect active indicative, which we will learn about in Lesson 15. The perfect middle passive indicative, which we will learn about in Lesson 15 as well. And finally, the aorist passive indicative, which we'll learn about in Lesson 16. So, what do you need to know about principal parts? Well, basically, you need to know what they are. You need to know that they are the 6 forms of Greek verbs from which all other forms can be built. You need to know where to find them. So the glossary in the textbook or a standard lexicon will be a great place to find them because you may encounter some of these principal parts or forms based on those principal parts in Greek texts that you're reading. For this class, we will not be memorizing principal parts, although in other classes, students might be asked to learn those. And so rather we will use principal parts and rather we will use the textbook to begin to recognize characteristics of tenses, those markers that tell us that we are in the future middle passive or in the aorist passive or in the future active indicative. You will also know that there is a list of verbs that appear frequently in the New Testament with their principal parts that you can use sort of as a tool as you continue to work with Greek. Here is the chart for the future active indicative. As with other verb charts, you will notice that the stem from the verb luo, I loosen, is in green. And onto that stem, we've added a sigma marked by brown. And this is the marker of the future tense. And onto that sigma, we have added the personal endings, and these personal endings should look quite familiar to you at this point. So you have luso, I will loosen, luces, you will loosen, luce, he, she, or it will loosen, lusomen, we will loosen, lucete, you all will loosen, lususine, they will loosen. It is worth pointing out as well that there is a future active infinitive, lusein, although it is fairly rare in Biblical Greek. All right, with this chart there in the left, let's talk a little bit more about the future active indicative. So for regular verbs, you will simply add a sigma to the stem as we have with this verb. And then we will add the primary endings, which are those same endings from the present active indicative. So o, eis, e, omen, ete, usin. Like the present tense, the future can denote both simple and continuous action. So luso can be translated both as I will loosen and I will be loosening. The second of those represents the continuous action. Here is the chart for the future middle indicative. Once again, you see the stem lu from the verb luo. You see the brown sigma, which is marking the future tense. And we've added personal endings that are identical to the personal endings of the present middle passive indicative. So, lusomai, luce, lucetai, lusometha, luceste, lusontai. And there is also a future middle infinitive, lucesthai, but it is also very rare. All right, again, just a few notes about the future middle indicative. Once again, we're going to add the sigma to the stem. Then we add endings from the present middle passive indicative. And it's worth pointing out that in the future tense, the middle and passive voices are formed differently. So we will only parse verbs that appear like this as future middle indicative. The future passive indicative will be introduced in a later lesson. So often we will see future middles that are middle in form, but they have an active meaning. A few other notes on the future. The first is you need to be aware that sometimes the consonant will change when you add the sigma. So for example, if you have a pi, a beta, or a phi, and you add sigma, you will get a psi. If you have a kappa, a gamma, or a chi, and you add a sigma, you will have a xi at the end. If you have a tau, a delta, or a theta, and you add a sigma, the result will be a sigma. Now, these are sort of rules. These are things for you to be aware of. Hopefully, when you find verbs in the exercises or in the Greek New Testament, there will be enough clues within that verb form to suggest that you can find the lexical form of the verb, that is the verb that is the present active indicative form, and that you can then begin to sort of guess what sort of changes have occurred because of the sigma. There are some other irregular futures as Croy provides on page 67. Please note that many of these are vocabulary already provided in the vocabulary list for the lesson. Go ahead and add those to your list and memorize them like you would any other vocabulary word. And most irregular futures and other irregular forms of verbs will be listed in the glossary or in a lexicon. So if you're not sure, you should be able to look up that verb form in a lexicon or in the glossary and get to that dictionary form, the present active indicative. All right, so here we have the future indicative of a me. You see, again, sort of the stem. It is just that eta at the beginning of the word, the marker of the marker of the future, the sigma in brown, and then we've added the endings. And these endings are all the same as in the future middle indicative. Esomai, ese, estai, esometha, eseste, esontai. As I've done with other forms of the a me verb, I would recommend you create a vocabulary card for each of these 6 forms. They occur frequently enough that you want to have them really well under your belt like you would have any other vocabulary forms. All right, so let's get started with the first exercise from the practice and review exercises. Ethaumatsomen en tois ergois tu didaskalou hemon, kai humeste thaumasiste en te hemera ekene. As has become somewhat of a practice for me, I would recommend that you begin by bracketing off the prepositions and genitive phrases. So when you do that, you actually just have ethaumatsomen in that first part of the exercise, and kai humes de thaumasiste in the second part. Well, then that makes the next step fairly easy. We are going to identify the verbs. And the first verb is ethaumatsomen. And you can see here I've broken it up, ethaumatsomen, to indicate the verb stem, which is thaumatso. You see the epsilon added, which indicates that we are in a secondary tense, in this case in the imperfect. And then the men ending indicates that we are in the active voice and that we have a first plural verb. So we would translate this, we were wondering. The next verb is similar, thaumasiste. Again, I've sort of broken it up, thauma, se, and you can see that the thauma is an indicator of our stem. You can see the addition of the sigma there, which is in brown, indicating the future tense. And then the indicator of the middle voice, este. We would treat this as a deponent and translate it with an active meaning, something like, you all will be amazed, or you all will wonder. So finally, we would find the subject and begin to work through the other parts of the sentence. Ethaumatsomen has an implied subject we, and humes is the subject of the second part. And then we would translate en tois ergois tu didaskalou hemon, which is just this long phrase, in or by the works of our teacher. And once again, we would translate en te hemera ekene as in that day. So if we were looking for a translation of this exercise, we would translate it something like, we were marveling in the works of our teacher, but you yourselves also will marvel in that day. And so I've added the yourselves because it seems to suggest that there's some emphasis. Remember that the verb form here in the second plural indicates that we don't need that. So there's some emphasis there. And then you remember that kai and day, when we have both of those, we would translate that as but also. And we've tried to bring out the thaumas this day, you all will marvel in that day. So if we were to parse tois ergois, we would say that it's dative plural and that it's neuter from ta ergon, and that it is in the dative case because it follows en. And then tu didaskalu is in the genitive case from ha didaskalas. It is a genitive that modifies ergois. It tells us which kind of works. And then finally, hemon is also in the genitive case. It is a first person pronoun. So it is, again, restricting or limiting the didaskalu. It's telling us which teacher, or in this case, whose teacher. And then te hemera ekene is all in the dative case. It's in the dative case because it's following en. And we would say that ekene, which is a demonstrative, is feminine singular dative because it's modifying te hemera, which is also feminine singular and dative. All right, that is the end of our video lecture on lesson 12. We will continue to add new verb forms in future lectures. So be sure that you are clear about the markers of the future active and middle indicative, as well as the forms of the future of a me. Thank you.